Yeah, so a little background why ChatGPT might have chosen us three for this project is that Vijay obviously wrote the Bullish Case for Bitcoin, which is Citadel related how exactly? Like it's about taking gold from one place to another and how hard that is, right? And how Bitcoin is better. So it has somewhat to do with physical places. And Allen obviously is a Venice guy, and Venice is a place. And I'm with the Free Madeira organization and also with the Free Cities organization, even though I wouldn't say I'm an expert on free cities. But in my mind, like the physical aspect of Bitcoin, like how Bitcoin is like the first thing that comes from people and then via the internet manifests into reality and not the other way around. It's usually that we put stuff from the real world on the internet. But this is like a Bitcoin is something that lives within you. If you think about so I'm going to do the philosophical rant thing here just because it's the only thing I know.
Should we stay on stage or like?
No, but if you think about what a Bitcoin actually is, it's they all live in our heads because all owning a Bitcoin means is that you keep a secret. So regardless of if you memorize your seed phrase or that you know the location of your open dime or whatever, you are the Bitcoin. And this is true even for the node runners and for the miners, because all they do is they run software on a computer. And if you think about what a computer really is, it's just an extension of our minds that does calculation for us, because we're really crap at calculation as human beings in comparison to computers. So a computer is just a fancy abacus that's extending our minds in a way. So everything in Bitcoin is predicated on human action and a person actually making a decision. So my experience with like Bitcoin communities and places in the world that become more like further on their journey towards hyper-Bitcoinization is that stuff happens online first. We form these communities and then people end up in somewhere in the world, a bunch of Bitcoiners, and then all of a sudden, all of our problems go away because we can always shoot each other's sats, and we're all incentivized to help one another, and everything just becomes swell because we're already on a Bitcoin standard. And yeah, is that your experience too? Like, is that how you view like how Bitcoin manifests into reality?
Yes.
Thank you.
When I think of this topic, I think of the flourishing of new communities and the creation of new cities. And one thing I think Bitcoin makes possible is people escaping to new locations where there is energy available, but there isn't a community. And I think Bitcoin is great for creating infrastructure where there's stranded energy. So that's where my mind goes to when I think about Bitcoin Citadel markets. Look at the American tradition, and it was always people escaping west. So the Puritans escaped the king in England, and the Quakers escaped the Puritans, and the Mormons escaped the Quakers, and everyone kept moving west, but then we ran out of space. I think Bitcoin allows us to find new places around the world which might not necessarily seem hospitable, but because they have huge energy resources, we have this buyer of last resort now, which is Bitcoin miners. And so you can get that basic energy infrastructure going and start small communities and have the equivalent of moving west again. So that's where I see some hope for these potential Bitcoin Citadel markets.
I think you can marry these two as well. So I think what you're describing there, Vijay, is sort of physical infrastructure, like the ability to easily bootstrap physical infrastructure in a way that's never really existed before if you do want to start fresh. But what Knut mentioned too is that once you've done that, I would argue this is kind of the subtext of the entirety of my book, is that it's really culture that matters the most. But the Bitcoin actually kind of offers that as well, or at least is starting to, right? That you could easily imagine having something around stranded energy and mining, bootstrapping your physical infrastructure, but the people who understand that in the first place and want to take advantage of it actually have quite a lot in common and have a similar vision of how to build social capital around that too, which is pretty cool.
That actually, I think, is a good segue into your book, which I just bought from Allen. I've read it, but I bought it and got a signed copy yesterday. I think culture is incredibly important, and I would like to ask you.
You read it in one day?
No, I read it previously.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's worth reading in one day, so go buy a copy. What was it about the culture of the Renaissance? What was it that made these cities flourish that we can learn from? I mean, there's this thesis that it was competition between cities, but perhaps also the monetary standard they were on. Is there a synopsis you can give about culture? You bring up that term, and I think that's a really important one as well, because we have this Bitcoin culture which has a lot of shared values, and as Knut was saying, they come from this online community, but they can manifest in the physical world. Like you look at El Salvador, you have all these people flocking to El Salvador because we have this president who's very supportive of Bitcoin, and that is attracting our culture. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and
yeah, sure. I mean,
and the Renaissance.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not a historian. It's more just like a shit poster, really. I don't have that much actual expertise in this. I just think it makes a good meme. But no, I think what attracted me to Venice Renaissance, like using that kind of imagery in the first place, is that, well, Venice in particular, there's more interesting tie-in actually with the previous comment just around this originally manifesting from the physical circumstances, but then extending well beyond that and lending itself to culture. That Venice is very, very easy to defend. I've said this loads of times. It's kind of a cliche now. It's very easy to defend and very difficult to attack, given the technology of the time, and that stimulates a culture where the only way to advance is trade and, well, just voluntarism more broadly defined, right? You're strongly incentivized towards capital accumulation rather than, rape and pillage, right? And so that's why I like that as a metaphor. It's obviously not supposed to be remotely literal or sort of helpful in terms of like, oh, we should build cities and lagoons or anything like that. But it's, I think it's encouraging in terms of the somewhat physical, if you want to think of Bitcoin that way, at least from the starting point of how mining works, right? Somewhat physical circumstances of it just being very, very difficult, if not basically impossible to attack. And that the only way you can use it, or the only way it makes any sense to use it, I think, is by adopting a voluntarist ethos.
Yeah, we've heard during this conference that Bitcoin is democracy money, but I think that's slightly inaccurate because it's more like anarchy money, and democracy is this word that is it's a taboo to even criticize the word democracy. Everyone's been like brainwashed for 12 years in these camps we called public schools into believing that democracy is like the greatest thing ever and that it has something to do with the will of the people. But Bitcoin goes beyond that. So when we make the transition from what we're living in now, which is clown world, to hyper-Bitcoinization, which is one divided by clown world, like do you see that path playing out by Bitcoiners breaking out and ending up in citadels and defending them from violations, or do we pander to politicians and take the diplomatic route? Like how is this going to play out in your minds?
So I actually have kind of well, I obviously think it's interesting, but somewhat heretical take for a Bitcoiner on this, on the interaction with democracy specifically. That I'm not really that attached to this, but I am just kind of curious as to how it plays out. That I wonder to what extent democracy gets a bad rap in the first place just because of fiat, right? Like the standard line. I do buy into a lot of this, to be fair, but coming from like probably Hoppe foremost, I think that's the biggest influence for most people in this line of thinking, is just that fiat encourages, I mean, he obviously doesn't put it in Bitcoin terms, but both fiat and democracy are inherently very high time preference. But then, in particular, the way democratic systems tend to be set up in the West encourage that and reinforce, how fiat then operates, that it's impossible to instill any kind of long-term thinking in the management of the money supply, I guess. So I'm actually kind of interested. I don't think I'm as bearish, I guess, on democracy as seems to be the kind of, the black pill standard within the Bitcoin community, because I'm just curious as to if politicians can't affect the money supply at all. I think that's going to change how they're able to operate. I'm more hopeful that more localized democracy than we're used to. Because I think another thing, I don't think Hopper really goes into this. It really is more of a Bitcoiner talking point, but just fiat rewarding bigness in general and there being a feedback loop there into politics. I'm willing to give democracy another final chance on a Bitcoin standard, because I think it'll be a lot more local and a lot more, it'll lend itself to good governance more. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not well, but more certainly. And
it will create this environment where there's actual competition between nation states, and Bitcoiners are usually quite mobile, so we're ready, willing, and able to move to another location if necessary.
Yeah, that's the other really exciting thing. We sort of alluded to this earlier, but it is worth making explicit that Bitcoin is it's sort of an underappreciated benefit, I guess. Like, people are aware of this, but I think it ought to get more attention, that Bitcoin is the first time there has been a completely mobile, not just store of wealth, but form of accumulated capital as well. For the entire, for all of history, for all of there being, people moving between different civilizations, if you really needed to flee, you had to leave everything. You don't anymore, which is pretty sweet.
Yeah, that reminds me of a picture I saw when the Ukraine war started. There was a picture on Twitter with a guy trying to escape. I don't remember if it was Ukraine or Russia, but the point was that he got stuck in customs and he had a briefcase with a bar of gold, a ton of rubles and a ton of euros and a ton of dollars, and the border control just took all of it. And you see the comments under the tweet, all the Bitcoiners say, "Look at this idiot that can't remember 12 words." So, and that means when a tweet like that goes viral, everyone who's in a similar position and thinking of leaving his country sees that playing out. So it spreads, the knowledge about this spreads by necessity, I think. And this is like the thing when you can store like most of your wealth in your head, and not as physical stuff, but as this abstract secret, that means that for an aggressor, it's more profitable for them to give you something of value back, to extract value out of you, than to attack you. Because if they attack you, they destroy the Bitcoin in the process. Yeah. And furthermore, if they point a gun to your head and say, "Vijay, give me all your Bitcoin," you can give me 0.1%, and I have no way of knowing how many Bitcoins you actually have. And this is true for every person on Earth right now. I cannot know how much Bitcoin another person has. It's impossible. So this is what I feel like changes the Schelling point of violence, and why these citadels might be viable as an option for people without having to be, all militarized and guarded by machine guns and stuff. At least that's what I hope, and I hope that this is a peaceful revolution. What's your thoughts, Vijay?
When I think of citadels, I think of politically autonomous communities, and I think Bitcoin certainly makes that much more possible than it was in the past. Charles de Gaulle said that he wanted a monetary base that did not bear the mark of any nation, and a politically neutral money, because the United States had taken over the reserve currency in the Bretton Woods Agreement, and by the 60s, it was clear that the US was not going to be able to pay back all the dollars that were out there and pay back in gold. So I think Bitcoin is an ideal currency for citadels and autonomous communities because it gives them sovereignty, real monetary sovereignty. And I think of the example actually of not a particularly nice nation, Venezuela, that had a lot of its reserves held at the Bank of England. And what they discovered was that when they wanted those reserves back for whatever nefarious purposes the dictator at the time needed them for, they couldn't get them back because they were not politically autonomous. They relied on the Bank of England. And I think Bitcoin certainly makes it possible for nation states to be much more autonomous than they are now and escape from the US financial network. The US has a lot of political power that it can bring to bear on nation states by saying, if you don't do what we want, you're out of the network. And, you know, classic examples of this are Iran and North Korea. So I think in the future, under a Bitcoin standard, we can expect much smaller, more autonomous communities which don't have this hegemon telling them what to do with their reserves.
Yeah, that begats a follow-up question. Can a nation state own Bitcoin? Like, they can do they can own custodial, but like not your keys, not your coins. And a nation state is just, you know, a bunch of people in a geographical area. But so how do governments, if governments really want to own Bitcoin, they need to do some sort of multi-sig setup, right? And can you imagine a parliament of politicians figuring out how to do multi-sig? Like, is that really a plausible scenario in the future that they will do?
I think at a large scale, certainly not. But the thing which is exciting is at a small scale, it's certainly possible. And I think Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador is an example of this, where you do have something like multi-sig in small communities where groups of people can come together and they can vote on how the resources of the community are spent and what they're spent on. And that's kind of a pure form of democracy. It's not democracy where you vote someone into power and that single person decides. It's where every person decides on every decision about how resources are allocated.
Yeah, this is back to what you said about like fiat incentivizes nations to be big and powerful. Yeah. And Bitcoin does the opposite because you need to figure out how to do multisig for it.
Yeah, I'm really glad Vijay mentioned that actually, because that's my previous comments I think were maybe a bit abstract. I don't know. I wasn't sure if I could even come up with a good example, but that's a perfect example where I think a good way of interpreting that is that this model, which is kind of a nice coincidence because it really just comes from how Bitcoin works in the first place, but this model can only really be implemented at a scale where people trust one another, right? Which I would argue is also far, far preferable. No, it's not even a point about democracy, really. It's just a point about governance, right? You ideally would be, to the extent you're governed at all, it would be by people you know and trust. And so, back to your question, though, Knut, I'm pretty sure that actually, yeah, larger nation states will try this and they'll get rugged and it'll be hilarious. And then, you know, we collectively will learn from their mistakes and end up with what Vijay described.
Yeah, I'm so looking forward to the point where they realize that they don't own any Bitcoin. Some guy owns the Bitcoins, and some guy can just fuck off and do something else.
How do you think El Salvador holds its reserves?
I don't know, but that was my first thought when I heard that El Salvador has Bitcoins, and for that reason, my first thought when MicroStrategy announced that they had Bitcoins, like, how?
Do you think?
Is it like the one of those nuclear bunkers with two keys, like a red key there and a red key there, and you have to like, the CEO and the CTO or whatever will have to, you know, turn the keys simultaneously. How does it work?
Because if it's might just have a Trezor under his pillow.
Sorry?
Bukele might just have a Trezor under his pillow.
Yeah, that would be neat. I mean, so, but this is a thing. Bitcoin sort of puts another attack angle against these people that think they own stuff, and it's not them, it's some guy. And I think they vastly underestimate the power of some guy, because some guy can do whatever he wants and just disappear.
Yeah. Or even more amusing way of thinking about it is they vastly overestimate the power of like fiat, but literally as in what fiat means, which is that they just will it into existence, and they can't will any more Bitcoin into existence, or they can't will back Bitcoin that they've stupidly lost. So that will be they'll try though. That'll be the most entertaining part, because when it happens, they won't understand what they've just done. They'll try to fix it by fiat. It'll be amazing.
The revolution will be televised, and it will be hilarious.
It will be
a comedy, a sitcom. All right, I think we ran out of time. There's a red flashing light here next to some weird-looking block clock on the floor. But I'd like to thank you all. Unfortunately, we have no time left for questions, I guess. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Miami, for the last 3 years in this amazing city. The whole world shut down, but Miami welcomed us with open arms. We want to show Bitcoin to the whole world. We are taking the conference on the road to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. Nashville. Bitcoin 2024 is coming to Nashville in Tennessee, a city that is known as a music and freedom city. Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville from July 25th to 27th.